Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? All right. This is going to be participatory, so get ready. No, in all seriousness, my plan actually is to end earlier than typical to open the audience Q&A, so be prepared for that. First of all, my name is Brandon Busteed. I'm Executive Director for Education and Workforce Development at Gallup, and I'm delighted to be a moderator for this incredible panel. Briefly introduce everybody. I know you see the bios, but we have Chris Eisgruber, who's the president of Princeton. We have Karen Gallagher, who's the dean of the Rossier School of Education at USC. Didn't have to travel far for this particular event. Tom LeBlanc, who's the president of George Washington University. We also have Jeff Maggioncalda, who's the CEO of Coursera. And last but not least, we have George Weiss, who is the chairman of Say Yes to Education. And so we have a really incredible group of folks who have a different perspective in certain respects about higher education, access to higher education. So I'm going to start with a statistic that probably many of you have not heard before. If you haven't, this is one that I think is an important one for all of us to kind of grapple with. But it's looking at college completion rates over the last half century. So if you go back 50 years in the United States, and you say, what percent of children born into the top quartile, socioeconomically, graduate from college? Half a century ago, that was 40%. What is it today? 80%. It's doubled. 8 out of 10 children born in the top quartile, socioeconomic status, graduate from college. Not go, graduate from college. Now you say, okay, what about those born in the bottom quartile? 50 years ago, that was 6%. What is it today? 9%, which was given away a little bit, I think, in the program description. So you read the program description. Congratulations for doing your homework in advance.
He knows.
Folks, in half a century, despite lots of very great efforts and well-intentioned initiatives, we have moved the needle on the bottom quartile socioeconomically from 6 to 9% in college completion rate. So I want to start there. Obviously, we've done a pretty good job for college completion for the top quartile, from 40 to 80%. So we know we can do this. What do we need to do? And maybe I'll just go down the line. So Chris, we'll start with you because you were talking about this in some respects last night on 60 Minutes. If those of you who missed it, Chris had a great piece about Princeton's initiatives around this. But how do we do better for that bottom quartile?
Yeah. So Brandon, thank you for the opportunity to speak to that. And I want to just start by underscoring the importance of the question. I think one thing that many of us on this panel recognize is that completion is what makes a difference when it comes to education. It's important to get low-income kids to college, but you got to get through college in order to get the benefits of the degree and the economic value which comes with that, which is very substantial. I would point to two things that I think are important and offer a lot of hope in that, Brandon. One is that institutions like my own, which are able to put a lot of support to ensuring that students complete their work, have to continue to raise our sights in terms of how many low-income students we're bringing to campus. So at Princeton, we are now taking 28% of our entering classes, either first in their family to go to college or coming out of a low-income background or both. That really matters because if you get a low-income kid on a campus like Princeton's, the chances are that they're going to complete, and after they complete, they're going to succeed. So just to give you the numbers on this, our completion rate for students coming out of the top income quintile at Princeton is 96%. Completion rate for students coming out of the lowest income quintile who come to Princeton is 93%. I'd love to close that tiny gap, but the fact is you get on our campus, we're going to provide the support. The kids are going to finish, they're going to get the degree. Second thing I would note is there's a lot of good work going on across the country using new techniques to gather information about how to support kids on campuses. One of the places that I think has had a lot of success is Georgia State University, very different kind of campus. About 56% Pell eligible at Georgia State. They have been using all sorts of techniques to identify where they can support students, using big data, for example, to understand when students may be slipping and when a touch matters, and without substantially increasing the resource spend per student, have taken their completion rates up about 22% to where they're in the mid-50s at this point. I know they'd like to get it higher. I'd like to see it go higher, but it shows a lot of hope from the right kinds of interventions on lots of different kinds of campuses.
That's right, and the completion rate overall is up there. They also now are equivalent in completion rates for underrepresented minority students compared to white students. So it's now one of the only campuses where those are consistent rates, and it's been driven by a lot of really great data analytics work and the things you pointed out.
Great point.
Karen, what are your thoughts?
Okay. Well, I agree with Chris that it's really important that all kids who you admit into your university, who you must believe can at least have the qualifications coming in to do the work. And USC has for about 25 years in some cases, we have felt that we can help low-income students come to our campus by partnering with public schools around our campus. So we have a program called Neighborhood Academic Initiative, which partners with 2 Los Angeles Unified School Districts that are in our neighborhood, where we start with kids in 7th grade, and we support them through bringing them on campus once a week for help with writing and math, and we get commitments from parents about what they're going to do. And 25 years later, we have over 1,000 kids who were in that program who've graduated from high school and have gone on to college, and a little under 500 of them have come to USC. So that's one, partnering with schools. The other we have is we have 5 charter high schools that are for students, low income, first generation, and that's another avenue. We are, those students are come in from all sorts of public middle schools, and we take them where they are, and through a combination of excellent teachers, personalized learning, we get 100%, now we're in our 3rd year of having a graduating class for our first school, 100% high school graduation rate, and 100% of those students have gotten at least 1 acceptance into a 4-year. And so we know the other thing we do is we have, we're one of the few highly selective universities that brings in transfer students from community colleges every year, and we bring in about 800 students. What we know is those students have the same completion rate as students who come in as freshmen, and our overall completion rate is 92%. So we know, instead of waiting for maybe a bigger initiative, universities can partner with their local schools, whether they're charter or public or some. We can't wait for others. We need to work with high schools, because I think that's absolutely important that we get kids to understand in high school what it's going to take to go to college.
And when you say 5 charter schools, those are operated or run by USC? Is that, I was just curious when you made that.
We can't run as a private school, public schools, but we have a 501c3 called Ednovate, and I chair the board on that. But they're teachers, and but they're public schools.
Got it. Yeah, helpful. That's great. Tom, what's your take on how we improve?
So let me start by saying that's a pretty shocking statistic. 50 years we go from 6% to 9%. And I think the first thing we need to understand is we've got 3 representatives of selective universities up here, and the vast majority of students who go to college go to public institutions and community colleges. And so they have to be a part of any solution to moving meaningfully this statistic. If all of the selective universities just admitted and graduated, I don't know how much impact it would really have on that national statistic, because we're just not a big enough part of the solution. It's ironic because I've been entirely educated at public institutions, and I've spent my entire professional life at private institutions. So I feel a little bit guilty, but if I have any credentials on this, I am a first-generation college student. My wife's a first-generation college student. So when we talk about that, we understand it in a way that's very personal to us. And on our campus, we have about 15% of our student body are Pell eligible. And then we have another significant fraction that's first-generation college student. And getting them in, universities are great on inputs. Mm-hmm. We can talk about exactly how many Pell-eligible students come in, how many first-generation students come in. We can talk about all the inputs on our diversity and our SATs and so on. And we have not historically been good about measuring our outputs. To some extent, it's easy to blame the ranking systems, which have sort of dominated the discourse on higher ed. which is again very interesting because it's often focused on our 10 or 15 of the most elite institutions and not where a lot of the action is. So I would say that we need to focus on our outputs, and graduation rates is the fundamental output. In our case, we work very hard to make the students feel comfortable on our campus. We have an urban campus. Most suburban campuses have the ability to kind of define the experience in a very regimented way just by their geography. And on an urban campus, you can't define the experience for each student because they're basically living in the city. And the city is our culture, it's our society, and they see it all there. So it's a challenge for us. But I will say a lot of the students recognize the urban environment when they come to campus. And we talk to them about issues like a good fraction of our faculty were first-generation college students. If you look at the influx, we've grown higher education over the last 50 years. So the percentages haven't moved what we'd like, but the numbers have moved dramatically. And a lot of those first-generation students from 50 years ago went on to be faculty in the universities today. So making the students understand that the people that they're living with, working with on this campus often came from where they came from helps make it more comfortable for them. I've talked very publicly about this on my campus. When I held a reception for the first-generation students, I asked them, how many of you are first-generation college students? And I was the first one to raise my hand. And you could see all the hands in the group. So the irony was it was a reception for just first-generation students. So it was a trick question. And I just looked at the audience and I waited, and they were very hesitant. And then I raised my hand, my wife raised her hand, we looked at each other, and I look out in the audience. And then they slowly kept coming up. And the few that didn't raise their hand, I said, it's a trick question, you're all first-generation college students. But that's a part of making them feel comfortable on the campus. Then, as was said earlier, we have to make sure they graduate. And that means dealing with the issues that come with the financial difficulties of going to college. And it's not just full cost of attendance. Dealing with the issues of what it means to belong and how you do that on a campus where you don't really control your boundaries, in particular on an urban campus. Dealing with the special needs of a person who's dealing with their family back home, which often brings finances, and dealing with the fact that an enormous number of our first-gen kids are working all the time. When I was in college, I worked a lot, my wife worked a lot, we see it now with the students. It's very hard to be a full-time college student and work 40 hours a week as well. And that can create issues on their academic progress and so on. So understanding that, creating support structures for that, and then constantly reinforcing the fact that they belong there is a big part of what we need to do to improve the statistic.
Yeah. So Jeff, Coursera was one of the pioneers in massively open online courses. Tell us about how Coursera is thinking about this right now.
Well, so people are probably pretty familiar with what Coursera did in the early days. We partnered with a lot of universities who published courses available to anyone who wanted to take them. And in the last, which had our 6-year anniversary, so in the last 6 years, 31 million people from around the world, 78% of whom are not in the US, have come to Coursera to take courses. And we have 150 universities who published 2,600 courses. Most of these are not for credit, they're open courses. You can take any of them for free, you can audit them, but if you want to get a certificate of completion, you have to take tests and prove that you've learned the material. What we've done in the last couple of years, which is not so obvious to folks, is in addition to the open courses, we've also started offering online degrees from our partners. So we have 3 degrees from University of Illinois. We have a degree from HEC Paris. We just announced in March another 7 degrees, including University of Michigan, ASU, Imperial College London, University of London. So a lot of our partners are now starting to provide fully accredited master's degrees online. We have a bachelor's degree as well. As I think about, the other big piece that we did a couple years ago is we launched Coursera for Business, where businesses now can hire Coursera so that our partners' content is available to people at work. 1,000 companies have now hired Coursera. The business is growing very rapidly. And it's not just the open courses. It's also degrees that are being now made available at work. So as I think about your question, it feels to me that for an undergraduate degree, it feels like preparedness is one of them. I think having kids who are qualified to and have the fundamentals to go through a college education is non-trivial. I think that economics is a big part of it. And I think that's both accounting cost, which is the tuition, but opportunity cost, which is so many people are working that the cost of not working in order to pursue a degree is very, very high. It turns out that when you look at our MBA program with the University of Illinois, they're almost all working. The average age is 37. The on-campus program is 27. So it's a different population. But I would suggest that offering degrees at work designed for people who are working would be a smart way to increase the rates. They'd have more support. They've got the financial support, a sense of belonging and encouragement from their employer, and maybe you'll earn it over a longer period of time. It doesn't need to be done in 4 years because that economic cost of missing out on your paycheck is not going to be so high.
Yeah, that's great. So George, I know you're not a university, but you've put probably enough kids through college that you qualify as a university. Tell us about your work.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer some of the questions that some of our panelists addressed. Basically, a thumbnail of Say Yes to Education. Right now, we have 130,000 inner city kids in our program, and it's a holistic approach where we come in and partner with different cities. We're going to announce in the fall our fourth city, which will bring us close to 180,000 kids. And we come in, and the first thing we do, which we probably don't publicize too much for obvious reasons, we redo the union contracts. But the first thing that technically we do is we bring in mental health clinics in every school, because the data shows that 24.8% of inner city kids in the worst part have mental health issues. And if you have a mental health issue, you're not going to be ending up going into these great schools that are on the dais today. We put a social worker in every school. We put mental health clinics around the city. We put in something very simple, a student monitoring system. If you look at the inner cities, nobody has a student monitoring system. How is Brandon doing in the classroom? What's his health situation? What is his attendance like? And the reason they don't want that is because they don't want a scorecard and how poorly they're doing. And we can go off tangent a little bit here, but the numbers I see from the inner city, and I don't care where they're from, they're all BS. They all make up the numbers, okay, to make them themselves look good. So you really have to look at the number of juniors in high school, the ninth graders that graduate high school. And you'll see that the real numbers out there are 24 to 8%. And everywhere you look, the numbers in the 50s and the early, the lower 60s. So then what we do is we do all the summer programs and the student, enrichment programs, et cetera. But then equally important is at the end of the sophomore year, I have to use the words a little bit carefully, and we partner with the guidance counselors. And most people know the guidance counselors in the inner cities don't do much. And so we have 103 private colleges, including the 3 colleges on this, the dais today, that offer my kids free tuition. So I'm really pleased with the partners, because 16 of my Say Yes kids go to the 3 schools represented. And the thing that we ask in return is we take the posse model, that you have to mentor and model mentor our kids. Okay, and that's a very, very key thing. But I want to address your question a little bit differently than some of the others, and I all agree. I don't care how many kids matriculate. I want to know how many kids graduate. And I do believe the data I see from the college. So even though I'm suspect of a lot of the data out there, when Princeton says they graduated 93%, you can believe that number. But I think one of the tragedies in the system, and see the schools up here, and I've been a trustee at Penn, we have enough financial aid to help these kids when they run into problems. But when you look at the average college, community college, when you look at the number of juniors that drop out of their programs because of financial aid, and the data is so devastating that how few these kids come back into the system. So if you want to increase the data, okay, a great fundraising goal, because usually it's $1,000, $2,000. It's not a huge amount of money. Yeah. So I think we can increase this data dramatically by making sure that those juniors don't drop out.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, we've got, it's an interesting mix of things happening in higher ed, because on one hand, there continues to be incredibly clear economic data about the value of a college degree. You were talking about this earlier today, and clearly the value of a bachelor's degree compared to somebody who doesn't have one, there's a lifetime benefit of between $900,000 and $1 million of lifetime earnings. You've all seen some of this data. At the same time that's true, we see things like a 400% increase in tuition price over the last 30 years, roughly. The total outstanding student loan debt in the U.S. is at about $1.4 trillion right now. About $1 trillion of that's been accrued since roughly 2003. And there are questions in the media frequently and at the dinner table about the value of a college degree. And so one of the things that's interesting, Jeff Salingo pointed this out on the Future of Higher Education session earlier today, there's about a 50% discount rate among colleges and universities right now, meaning a difference between what their published price is and what people actually end up paying. And so, there's a lot of things circling around this. I'm going to ask this question: Is access and affordability essentially the same thing now? And add to that, right? If the published price is effectively a 50% discount, why don't we just put out the actual price? And what's the value to publishing one sticker price and offering average 50% discount? So I would like you guys to kind of talk about that a little bit. Maybe I don't know. We don't need to go in order this time. So George, I'll start with you on this one. Is access and affordability the same thing?
I gotta, as Michael Milken likes, I never answer a question that's asked, but
I'm gonna try and get you. I'm gonna pin you down on this one.
You get me, pin me down. Is what I'm a believer of is what you have to give these kids is an equal opportunity to succeed, because the experience I've had, and I've been doing this for 32 years. These are great kids. What you have to do is increase the expectations. You have to offer these kids hope. Okay, by having them have the opportunities to go to some of the schools on this dais. Okay, it's a great opportunity, and it just sets a standard for the community. Hey, listen, this kid's gone to Princeton, this kid's gone to USC, this kid's gone to George Washington. So it raises the expectation on the whole city. So I'm not a great one, looking at the discounted value, but I really want to increase the expectations of these kids, because historically, the teachers, the principals, the parents, they all have low expectations. So when you aim low, that's where you shoot. So if you give these kids an opportunity and they see their friends, their siblings, et cetera, going to these great schools, that raises the whole expectation of the city. So I know I didn't answer your question, but I don't.
Yeah, well, I tried. No, we'll come back. We'll try and get you later. So Chris, how do you think about this? I mean, Princeton University, obviously one of the elite brands in the world, and it obviously is not an inexpensive experience. Much like my alma mater, I think Duke just posted $71,000 a year price between tuition, room, and board, and I'm not excited about that number, right? I'm very proud of the institution. I think we're doing great work, but I don't know. How do you think about this access and affordability mix?
Yeah. So look, for a reason I'll come back to in a moment, I don't think access and affordability are the same thing. Let me start though by explaining what is our financial model and Duke's financial model as well, both being endowment-driven institutions. So we offer what is a very high quality kind of education that makes a very strong bet on human capital, and the idea that if you put a lot of resource into extraordinary human capital, the returns to the world are going to be extraordinary. Those students are going to go on, whether they're coming from low income backgrounds or wealthier backgrounds, to do remarkable things. And that's why we're investing so aggressively in the students who come onto our campus. We subsidize every student who comes onto our campus. A full tuition payer, even at a high price, is basically paying for about half the cost of their education. That's a lot of investment in that student, but we think that's very worthwhile. We use a discount rate, and at Princeton, 60%, that's 60% of our student body is on financial aid. The average scholarship at Princeton is, if you're on aid, is above the tuition price, because some of them are getting room and board along with that. And the 83% of our students are graduating with zero debt. Of those who have debt, they're graduating with, on average, somewhere around $7,000 or $8,000 in debt if they've taken on loans for some sort of summer program or something else.
Chris, could I ask something? I
Yeah,
thought,
George.
Princeton, and
Sure.
I know Penn it's no loan.
Yes, we're no loan.
Okay, so how do these students come out with debt? Is this?
So it's only 17%, but what they're doing is they're deciding at some point to make a discretionary purchase and finance that through a loan that they're not required to take. It maybe they're buying an additional laptop computer, they want to take on a summer experience. I mean, again, some of those are subsidized as well, but they may make some discretionary choice to take on a small amount of debt. Less debt, by the way, than I had, even in nominal terms for the most part, right? My debt at graduation from Princeton, 1983, was $7,500, translates to about $17,000 today. I thought it was a very good deal. Our students who are taken on debt are graduating with debts in about the same range, but most of them are not taking on any debt. Nobody is required to do that. So that's why we use a discount price, because for the kids who are coming in with the capacity to pay, right?
Yeah.
Most of those kids and their parents, if there were an option to get admission to our university and pay an even slightly higher price, they would be willing to do that because of the return on the investment. I don't know where that is. That
Sounds like a pretty good return.
talk about return on investment. There we
Sounds like it's been a good year
public
for the
service
university.
for whatever company that was, clearly. But so Brandon, let me turn. So that's why discount price is important, and I think it's the right way for us to go about offering this education, because there's no reason we should be offering the same financial aid to students coming out of wealthy families that we do to students coming out of low-income families. We'd be less able to help those who really need the help. When you ask whether access and affordability are the same thing, I'd say clearly not. We had a financial aid program at Princeton since 2001 that we think was the best in the country, and that has been rated by both Kiplingers and the government as extraordinary in its capacity to make education affordable. Until we started really going out there and finding ways to identify students, get them into our applicant pool, make sure that we were selecting them, make sure that we were yielding them by bringing them to our campus and showing them what it was like to be there, and then supporting them on the campus, we weren't really getting the students to and through Princeton that George and his program and others were producing. So it's more than just having the financial aid program there. Right. That's indispensable, but you got to do the other things to make sure you're getting those students, bringing them onto campus, supporting them, and graduating them.
Yeah, those are well said points. And obviously, as I asked this question, it's driven by what Gallup does a lot of research on. What are the public perceptions of higher education? And in the public perception data, there is a lot of people tie access and affordability in their minds. And so I think the way you frame that makes a lot of sense, and it would be helpful if more people kind of knew and understood those things. But so Karen, how do you think about access and affordability?
Okay, first of all, USC, unlike Duke and Princeton, is not an endowment university. We are tuition driven. Our operating budget university-wide is about a little over 50% of our operating budget as a university comes from tuition. So clearly, if we fail a student, if a student can't get through, that does have an impact. We provide over $600 million a year in tuition, in scholarships from our own money for kids who can come and want to come but can't afford it. So, but I want to go back to access, because one of the things that USC did to improve and get its graduation rate up to in the 90s, and we're still not done, is that we looked at what we were doing as a university, our decisions that were hampering kids moving forward, whether they were first gen or not. When faculty were making the decision about when they wanted to teach classes, when it was at that level, we were finding a lot of gen ed classes, which everyone has to have, were all between Tuesdays and Thursdays from 8 until noon or 8 until 2. Well, you can't get through if the classes you have to have are all, they're in conflict with one another. So universities in general have to look at what they do that hampers how any student, not just first gen, can or cannot get through. But also for first generation low income students, just getting them to the door, getting them in, ready, and getting them to campus as a freshman. There have to be programs for them. I think you alluded to that. There are things they don't know that that limit their ability to do well. And I want to give one example from our first 2 classes at USC Hybrid High, which is our school that's been around since 2012. We're doing a longitudinal study of the first 2 graduating classes to understand not only what they got in high school that enables them to go to college, and then what keeps them there. And one of the things we've found that they tell us has really helped them is that we have every juniors and seniors on Fridays get a choice of what they're going to do on campus. And one of them is meeting with a teacher. So they learn how to make an appointment with their teacher and what it's going to be about. We have heard from our students who are freshmen and sophomores that is a help them. Because a lot of kids, whether they come from low income or high schools that do very well, don't take advantage of office hours. So that what we've taught them to do is ask, if you don't understand something, if you need help, or if you want to just talk, go to the professor's office hours. And that's a soft skill in a way, but it really has helped them, and they have found, we don't know yet because we haven't gotten anyone through college, but it is important to also help them understand professors are there to help. They have office hours and they want you to come and ask them questions.
And so, Jeff, in many ways, Coursera is a fascinating experiment about both access and affordability, because you said basically anybody in the world can take any number of 2,600 courses offered by 150 universities for free.
Yeah.
What are you learning about that? I call it an experiment, but obviously it's more than that for you. What are you learning about that?
Well, a lot. I think that if you don't have affordability, you're going to have a tough time with access, right? I mean, lack of affordability can create lack of access, but that's necessary, not sufficient. Clearly, preparedness is a big deal. Yeah. Just one example, and it's fascinating. Coursera, we don't author any courses. We have partners that author, and we are generally a place for people to come to get access to not just courses, but also degrees. And now we're working on sub-degree modules that we're calling Master Track Certificates, which are pieces of degrees that our partners are offering. But right now, we have a series of 6 courses authored by Google. It's called the Google IT Support Certification. It was designed so that someone with no college degree and no technical background in 8 months can become a certified IT specialist. And there's 150,000 open jobs in America. There's 450,000 open IT jobs in Latin America. Huge job demand for IT specialists. Google has set up a scholarship fund. They will actually pay for up to 12,000 seats so that people who don't have the means to pay $49 a month can earn this. I just mentioned we've just announced a bachelor's in computer science from University of London. They are planning to award credit to anyone who finishes the Google IT certification. And they will use your performance in the Google IT cert as part of your admissions criteria, and you'll be able to do all this at work. So you don't have to forfeit your paycheck as you're doing this. The final thing is that University of Illinois, the #2 computer science program in the country, is offering a master's degree in computer science. The same degree as you get on campus is $25,000. And so you can imagine a world where someone at work starts with a Google IT cert, no college degree, no background in IT, then gets a bachelor's in computer science from University of London, and then goes on to get a master's degree from one of the top-ranked programs in the world. And potentially the whole thing could be paid for by the employer.
Yeah.
So that kind of flexibility could really change the game.
Right. And Tom, earlier I heard you speak about George Washington going test optional a couple of years ago. There's some interesting things you said about that. Tell me your experience of that, or anything else you have to say about the access affordability equation.
So we did go test optional 2 years ago, and part of it was to increase the diversity of our applicant pool. And we were very successful in that. Our applications were up in the first year. It's a 2-year-old experiment, so I don't have a lot of data. But we were able to increase the number of underrepresented minorities by 33% in the first year of the program. And after the first year, we showed that the freshman GPA that was predicted in the absence of an SAT was just as accurate as the freshman GPA predicted with the SAT plus the high school GPA, et cetera, which basically tells you something that everyone in higher education knows. The best predictor of freshman performance in college is their high school record, not the SAT. So I think that's been important as an access issue. I do want to answer a question in a very direct way that you posed earlier that in higher ed we tend to shy about, but I think our mission of education is a public good. So the answer to your question is, with all these discounts, why don't you just lower the price? And the answer is because we vigorously price discriminate on socioeconomic background. And I feel totally and morally justified in doing it. When this question came up, I was teaching a 2-week part of a seminar with students, and I asked them to propose the tuition increase for next year, and I explained to them exactly what was going on in terms of financial aid policy. And I had students in the class who were on full scholarship, and I had students in the class that were full pay. And at the end, they voted in the class to price discriminate against the students of means in the class. We don't explain it that way very often. I think we're afraid there'll be some kind of pushback, but the answer is Higher education is a public good, and we vigorously price discriminate on the basis of ability to pay.
I like that framing. I mean, that's an effective message, I would think, and in terms of getting through around the complexity of that. Because you're right, the average person asks, well, why not just lower the price? And again, back to the public perception pieces of this and how we do a better job there. So this is my last question for the panel. So we'll go through this. It's a little bit of a hypothetical, right? So the 6-year average graduation rate for U.S. institutions of higher education is about 60% right now. And some people would look at that statistic and say it needs to be much higher. We've all talked about the importance of graduating and getting the degree, not just going. But we're at 60%. And so there's a theoretical question asked. What is the right graduation rate? Right? Theoretically, if it was 100%, you would arguably devalue the credential because it means that everybody who pursues it gets it. So I mean, it's a question. What's the hypothetical graduation rate? And or if you don't want to answer that one, this is really for George to give you two options. The other one is the definition of graduating starting to change? And so I'll let you guys run from there. Chris, do you want to lead us off? What's the right graduation rate?
Yeah. Well,
98%?
no. Look, let me say some things about it. I find it very hard to pick out an ideal graduation rate. So the observations I'll make are, first of all, although there are lots of different credentials that may come into play in a changing educational space, I think we should still care about graduation rates, and in particular, getting college degrees, especially for low-income kids. The 4-year college degree is the difference maker in terms of the likelihood that a kid is going to move out of the lowest income quintile or the second lowest income quintile into a higher income quintile. So yeah, let's be creative about the way we supply education, but let's keep our eye focused on how important those degrees are to addressing some of the socioeconomic inequalities in this country, and also to giving this country the benefit of the extraordinary talent that's out there from low-income groups. The reason I'm reluctant to look for an ideal number is I think it's great anytime you're finding ways to be creative, as Georgia State has been, for example. University of Texas has done some great things to raise those graduation rates. You're doing better by your students at that point. I don't think you're ever going to want to look at 100%. As I said, at Princeton, we're providing enormous amounts of support, 96% graduation rates, even from the most well-off kids. And then sometimes you're going to want to take a chance on a kid where you don't know whether or not that kid's going to graduate or not. And so putting it too high is going to eliminate that. So we've got to push it up in some ways. I think those of us in higher education know we've got to be pushing those numbers up and looking for more ways to get kids to graduate. And I don't need to know what the ideal number is to know that that's a worthwhile mission.
Right. And look, it's an interesting question to pose. It's unfair in certain respects, but because you've got very different demographics, right? So go back to the selectivity thing. Princeton, obviously very different in terms of the caliber of a student it selects. Theoretically, you would think those are students that, at least they should, able to complete more so than students at non-selective institutions. There's some institutions where 80-90% of their students are from poor families, and you would expect them, therefore, to have a lower graduation rate overall, right? So some of this is a difficult thing to kind of peg because you've got institutions who have very different profiles on the front end. And of course, there's been some controversy around this. You look at historically black college universities. One of the things they've been critiqued for are low graduation rates, right? And high student loan default rates. And although that's data that certainly need to be paid careful attention to, one of the interesting things in our research with Gallup and studying alumni outcomes is that black graduates from historically black college universities have had some of the best experiences in terms of how they were supported during college of any graduates from any type of institution we look at. And so, so that's a little bit of a different story, right? You say, okay, are the graduation rates lower? Are the student loan default rates higher? Yes, that's all real data that we have to pay careful attention to. But in terms of alumni outcomes, those black graduates from HBCU institutions are doing incredibly well, even more so than black graduates from any other type of institution, or let's just say predominantly white institutions. So in any event, I think there's very different ways to look at it. Karen, what's your take on graduation rate?
So I'm going to start by saying, like Tom, I too am a first-generation college graduate, and I know my life has been entirely different than it would have been had I not graduated. So I've spent my professional career in higher ed doing things that I think pay it forward. the schools that we have, the Innovate schools we have are primarily low income, and every one of those parents, they have a choice to put their kids in a charter school or trying to get into one. They want their kids to graduate from college. So there's no hesitation on their part about, should we do, is this important? They want their kids to graduate. Our philosophy at the Innovate schools is you go to college to provide, it's a means to providing positive multi-generational change. So it isn't that it's going to college so you can get a great job, it's because it will affect everything about your life and your children's lives and your grandchildren and so on. So given that, I actually believe that we should try to say we're going to, in our universities, we should graduate 100%. If we say less, then when we don't make that, it's the kids' fault. So I think by saying to ourselves, everyone we admit should be able to graduate, then we look for when that isn't happening, and we look every year to see what it is, we begin looking, what is it about us that has been the barrier? Things happen, we'll never make 100%. But if we set our sights lower, then we can always say it's the kids' fault, not ours.
Yeah.
Brandon, can I take a shot at this question?
Yeah, I knew I'd get you.
I don't think the panel likes your question, by the way.
That's fine.
Because what's interesting, you're talking about human beings, and I'll give you an example of a situation. What Say Yes basically does is we try to, level the playing field, give these kids an equal opportunity, have them increase the high school graduation rates, and if the kids are able to then go on and complete a 4-year college education. We partnered with Guilford County, North Carolina, 4 years ago, Rachel? And what's interesting is the situation was completely reversed for us, because I believe the number was like 88% of the kids graduated high school. Why? Because they set the standard so low in some of the southern states, because the goal of these kids would graduate high school and go to the mills to work. So it was about finding a job. All of a sudden, Say Yes comes in and says, hey, listen, we want to increase the standards so these kids, and I think they had like a 12% matriculation rate in college, which is completely reversed from all the data. So I think it, in a backhanded way, answers your question that if we end up doing what they did in some of these southern states by lowering the standards, you can increase. But I don't think that's where we want to end up.
Yeah, I mean, we're at an all-time high of national high school graduation rates in the United States right now. And we're
Say
also
that again?
We're at an all-time high of the percentage of students who graduate from high school in the U.S. since we've been tracking the data.
It's
about
know
83.2%.
how do you know it's accurate?
Well, I mean, that's the federal data on high school graduation.
Okay,
Those who are
I
receiving
will
diplomas,
contend that it's
right?
inaccurate. I had a lady
So-
in my office that has, started a foundation, was asking, for my advice, and she worked in, I think, New York City does as good a job as anybody, but she worked for the Board of Education. She was told to put in the numbers of the kids, graduating high school, with no background, no proof. Okay, so I think that number's bullshit.
Well, if it is or isn't,
He doesn't
it's
like
been
your questions.
reported.
He doesn't like your
Yeah,
questions
and
or
he
your
doesn't
answer.
like my
He doesn't like
That's right. And I usually only get offended on one of the two, not both. Well, where I was going with it, George, is that we're also at an all-time high of enrollment in remedial courses in higher education.
I agree.
And we just did a poll last week for communities and schools, and it turns out that 3% of U.S. adults say that high school graduates are very prepared for success in college. 3%. So your point about it being BS, right? Whether it's being reported
That's not the
accurately or
word
not,
I used.
right? There's certainly some question about the value of a graduation rate marker, which up until recent times, right, we took high school graduation rates to be one of the most important markers of how the country was doing, how schools were doing, right? So it does start to question, some of the metrics that we have in that data. But anyway, thanks for making me feel great today. So Tom, tell me something.
I like the question because much like the natural rate of unemployment, it raises a very interesting question. The natural rate of unemployment is not zero, right. Even in a good functioning economy. And we need to think very carefully about the selective universities in particular. If you get to decide who to admit, you really have a responsibility to make sure they graduate.
Right.
But not all universities are able to manage their admissions in the same way. One area where there's been low-hanging fruit that I've always focused on, The great tragedy is how many students drop out within 12 hours of graduation. And whatever the barriers are, and there are a variety of barriers, sometimes they get sick, sometimes the economics of staying in school just become overwhelming, whatever. And we've worked very hard at both my current institution, my prior institution. We identify every student within 12 hours of graduation and do everything we can to get them through the finish line. Because as I said earlier today, someone who's just shy of the credits necessary is called a high school graduate for life. And that's a penalty that's way too high, particularly when you're within one semester of graduation. So we've done things around extraordinary scholarships. We've allowed them to do certain things online because they may have already moved away from the school, to make sure that any student within 12 hours can graduate if they have any interest in graduating. And we have personal counselors, call them up, talk them through it, help them re-enroll, do all the things necessary to get them out. But I think that looking at some of the low-hanging fruit, the answer really is it ought to be higher than it is. It ought to be higher than it is across all of higher education. I don't anticipate that we'll ever get to 100% for exactly the reason Chris raised, is that if we don't have institutions willing to take a chance on some of these students, we're going to lock them out before they even get their shot.
Brandon, one last thought. Graduation rate for a bachelor's degree is a special case of what I think of as a much more general question, which is what should the credential completion rate be? I do believe, Chris, that you're right. The value of a bachelor's degree or a college degree today is very high. That might change over time. There's a lot of new programs, lots of new credentials, and when the job market, when the employers start recognizing other credentials, those might be pretty valuable credentials that might have a better return characteristic for certain students. So I think of it really much more for a certain type of credential, what do we want the credential completion rate to be, and then how many people should be earning each type of credential at what cost. But I think you'll see a much wider range of credentials that are valuable, and I think you'll see a much wider distribution of people earning different credentials at different times in their lives.
So we're open to questions from the audience, and are you going to bring a mic around? Is that right? Yeah. So we'll start with you, sir, and then we'll come up in front.
Does George get to not like the question?
No, George is officially banned from answering any further questions. I'm pulling my moderator. Yes, sir.
I'd be interested from hearing from the three selective elite institutions on the panel. How do you reconcile and balance the noble aim of what we've been discussing this afternoon with the other all-important battle that you're facing every single day, which is maintaining your rankings in the league tables, and most importantly, now getting to the harsh economics, the juggling act I'm sure you must feel of the pressure from alumni donations, legacy kids, versus the first generation noble applicants that we've all been talking about?
I'm happy to take a shot at that. I think in everything we do, we have to be focused on what our mission is. And the way we think about our mission in terms of undergraduate education is finding students who will be able to make an increased contribution to the world by virtue of what they get out of a Princeton education. So when I'm looking for what students to bring to our campus, I'm not looking for the winners of a test-taking competition, and I'm not looking to produce the winners of test-taking competitions. I'm looking for ways to produce students who are going to make a positive difference in the world. One of the reasons that I am so focused on the benefit of taking more low-income students is that the value add that we produce in terms of what they can do for the world is extraordinary. And I know that there's extraordinary talent there where if we're just focused on sort of the low-hanging fruit, the kids who have already shown what they can do because they've had so much extraordinary preparation, we're not going to do as much for society. So that for me is the way that some of these various tensions get balanced. There are pragmatics in terms of continuing to attract support and do other things. It'd be a lot tougher if it were all by its nature a zero-sum game. I don't think it is, right? So one of the things that we are doing right now is expanding the size of the undergraduate student body at Princeton. That's so that we can start to take some community college kids as transfers. It's so we can take more military veterans, and it's so that we can take more kids from low-income backgrounds as we continue to take a lot of the kids that we've taken before. And I'll tell you that program that recognizes the need to do a lot of different things is tremendously popular with our alumni who are extraordinarily proud that we are willing to go out there and make a difference in the world in that way.
You want to add anything to that?
I would just say it's a great question, and that's why you see this incredible increase in multivariate modeling in college admissions processes. because we've got a variable for everything you just mentioned. And we sit down and we say, as an institution, how do we achieve our enrollment goals, our financial goals, our quality goals, and all the other goals, diversity goals, et cetera. And each year, we're modulating at the margins from last year towards some future goal of what our optimal student body will look like. And it is a tremendous balancing act. And I will say, in this balancing act, the rankings have been absolutely zero help. Every college president I know sees zero value in these rankings. Wherever they are in the rankings, they see zero value. I would say for decades, the US News ranking created a paranoia about SATs that damaged an entire generation of students. The only good thing I have to say about that ranking, and I realize this is being recorded, is that they finally started focusing on graduation rates. And what you see if you study these things, and America writ large does not, they just look at the rankings, but what you see is there's been a gradual evolution away from things like the SATs, like class rank, and a very much increased evolution towards graduation rates. In fact, they got so clever that after a while they decided to account for the differential inputs. So they not only judge you based on your graduation rate, they judge you based on your predicted graduation rate given the quality of the students that you took in. And so you can get a negative factor even if you have a very high graduation rate if your input suggested it should have been even higher. And I think that is something that's been a very positive development and long time coming.
That's great. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I just want to say I don't have the same level of understanding that presidents do, but I do know that we have 12 variables that we look at, and for this incoming freshman this coming fall, we had over 60,000 applications for 2,700 slots. So we are able to, look at what we want and change that. And I don't think we're trying to increase our undergraduate numbers. So that is an enviable position to be in, to have more students, but it also, it's not just one variable we look at. And I think that's the way college admission ought to be. Is for us, it's 12 different things we're looking for.
Great. And that's your question?
Very simple.
Can you say it into the mic?
What's your definition of completion or graduation rate? Is it 4 years or is it 6 years?
Well, the stat I threw out was 6.
It's 6.
Yeah, 59% is the 6-year graduation rate.
So I guess
currently.
my observation would be that if that number could go down to 5 or 4 years, you would have a very high return on investment. So perhaps the hybrid model of getting some college credits, no matter whether you have high income family or middle or low, might be a way to generate more throughput from various well-regarded educational institutions.
Yeah. Anyone want to comment on speed of throughput?
If I could just say something about 6-year graduation rate, that is the federal statistic that we all measure and report on for comparison purposes. Every time I mention the 6-year graduation rate to a group of parents, they said, oh my God, they expect us to take 6 years. It's not true. I believe the federal government's reasoning was, for idiosyncratic reasons, a lot of students don't finish quite in 4 years. All you have to do is get mono and you're at 4.5 years. And so they said, what we really want is a statistic that captures 99.9% of all cases. So how far out do I have to go to get pretty much all of these idiosyncratic reasons? And the answer came back 6 years. So the vast majority of your graduates will be in 4 years, but the statistic is saying, practically speaking, how many are getting out in 6? The interesting question is one about the throughput question. And I've talked to some folks who actually have created 3-year programs at very selective, very distinguished universities, and the students don't want them. Students with a lot of AP credit say, I'm still getting my 4-year education, and they just go farther than they might have otherwise, even though they have the placement. So right now in the marketplace, certainly at the selective universities, there is very little interest on the part of the student body and presumably their parents to actually shorten the degree program to 4 years. Now, for first generation students who are working 40 hours a week, that's probably a very different thing. or middle-class families. But generally what we've seen is very little acceptance in the marketplace of speeding up the time to graduation.
And arguably, I think if you're not forfeiting an income, if you're working, maybe it's good to have 6 years. Maybe what you should do is give people more time. If you're working and learning at the same time, kind of what's the rush? Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yes, another question back there. Thank you.
First, an observation to you, Tom. My daughter's a junior through school, and I understand your idea of price discrimination because I paid full price for 3 years. It's been a wonderful education.
Thank you.
But honestly, my question on access is with regard to the whole early selection, early decision process. You know, I've been through this now 3 times with my kids. I'm not an expert, but it really seems slanted against lower income families because you're basically saying, I'll pay you whatever it is, let my kid in. And I'll know every school I go to, they go, no, it's not the same acceptance rates. And I just saw some of the Wall Street Journal last week, which is not. So I think that's part of this question of access is that higher wealth families can take that risk, which that means fewer spots for the rest of the world. So I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, USC does not have early admission for probably that very reason, but we have resisted it. We don't have early admission.
Early admission is a direct response to the rankings focusing on yield. And the way you increase your yield is you grow your early decision, and then you discover, oops, it discriminates exactly against the population you described, and then you're playing catch up in the latter half of the admission cycle. So I agree exactly with your point. We do have early admission at GW. We don't get a huge fraction of our class from early admission, but I think it's about 10% now. So it's not zero, but it's not dominant. There are institutions where as much as half of their freshman class is early admission. And as you say, so that people understand, at the time of early admission, they're committing to come without knowing their financial aid package. They're hoping and praying that you're a very competitive financial aid package, but you might not be, and they will never get a chance to find out. And for families for whom that is the be-all, end-all, they really can't afford to go early admission.
I just want to clarify, there are 2 kinds of early admission. There's early action, which is what we use, in which we admit some students early. They are not required to come to Princeton, and they're absolutely free to apply elsewhere. And then there's what you described, Tom, which is early decision, which is binding on both, and which I agree has the kinds of effects that you're describing. And I do think, you know, there was a brief period when we tried eliminating the early program entirely, as did Harvard, and I think Virginia, partly because we had hoped that that would lead to other institutions eliminating it and taking this out of play. We eventually decided to restore early action, but not early decision, because we did think that we could continue to recognize and get other students in without taking away the choices that students have if they apply early. And some of our students who are applying early out of programs, I don't know whether this is George's program, but on a number of different programs, are actually coming out of our low-income feeder programs.
Yes, sir.
I've been reading a lot about some universities and alternative education universities are doing tuition free and then these income share agreements, ISAs. I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on that. Like Purdue and...
Yeah, Purdue.
I think everybody's pulling a George, no answer.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll give a quick answer on that. I don't. Look, it seems to me reasonable that there are some universities that would use that as a financing mechanism. I don't think there's something about it that makes it inherently attractive. So, again, our view is that we're going to provide financial aid that we think makes it affordable for everyone who has need to attend the university and to graduate with very low debt. And then we're going to charge what is a discounted price to those who are able to pay that price, but expect full price there. And I'm not sure I see an inherent advantage to the kind of arrangement that you're describing.
Yeah, Mitch Daniels commented on earlier, you know, Purdue's done it for about 3 years now. They've had about 200 students take advantage of the income sharing agreement. And obviously it's based on investors, right? As he called it, kind of an equity investment. And so, you know, the investors who are investing in these students are investing in students, no surprise, who are going into high yield STEM programs in terms of the highest expected earnings, and so they're better bets because they're looking at a specific field. So I think it's going to work in certain pieces. I don't think it's going to be a widespread tool, but it will be one of the tools that some students and families will have access to. But using the Purdue data, a pretty big institution, they've got obviously a bunch of families taking advantage of it, but they aren't huge numbers. So I just got the sign back there that says session over. And,
What does that mean?
And with that,
How would you interpret that, Brandon?
yeah, well, I've had a lot of shots taken at me today, and that was exactly how we should have ended. Session over, Brandon. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to our panelists very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to